The calculation of the inflation rate obviously is pretty complex. The whole idea of figuring out how much inflation there is in our economy, if you just start thinking about it, how do you do that? How do you price out all the food and the clothing and the housing and all the things that go into figuring out how much more we're paying on a monthly basis? Well, the way they do that is a thing called the Consumer Price Index. Now, the Consumer Price Index is an index that they have created and maintained since 1913. And since 1913, at that point, it started out at 10. And now it has increased until it is up to 289.109. Now, the way that we calculate the inflation rate from that number then becomes an exercise in mathematics. And really, it's quite a simple exercise once they have figured out the index. The index is by far the most complicated thing. So what the people that compile the Consumer Price Index do is they have a set group of places that they survey on a monthly basis to find the change in cost of particular items based on previous surveys that they've done. They then take and compile all that, and statistically they massage it down till it's just one raw number that represents the amount of increase in those prices since 1913. Now, what is useful to us is we can then go and look at that consumer price index and be able to then extrapolate from it what the inflation rate was between the current month that they've reported, which is April of 2022, and any month or year that you want to. So if you want to see how much inflation there's been in the last decade, you can do that. If you want to see how much it was just in the 1980s, you could go into this site here and look at the data, and I'll show you how to formulate that. In fact, I'll have my editor, when he puts together the video, put the formula up on the screen. But generally what you do then is I'm going to pop up my calculator here and bring it on over. And so let's say I want to compute the inflation rate from this year to last year. Do you remember what the news media told you? The news media told you that it was 8.3%. Now, there are two flavors of the CPI, and therefore there are two flavors of inflation. Now, what you've been reported on the news media is what they call the headline inflation rate. The headline inflation rate includes energy and food. The core inflation rate, which is somewhat lower at this point, does not include the food or energy components in it. Now, in order to then compute what the headline rate is, because these numbers are compiled for the headline rate, or if you look up here, their fancy term for it is the All Urban Consumers, or CPI-U. If you look at that, we want to take 289 and 267 as our two numbers to compare. Okay, so what we want to do then is we want to take 289, and let's go ahead and move this over here. 289.109, and we want to subtract what it was last year at this time in April, 267.054, and we come up with a number of 22.05. Now, to figure out how much inflation that is, we divide that then by the last year's number. Okay, and when we hit the equals key, bingo, there is our 8.258, and of course they rounded up to 8.3% inflation rate. The last figure you do to turn it into a percent, of course, is to multiply that times 100, and there's your 8.3 or 8.258. Okay, so that's how it's computed. And I love to go to this particular site called usinflationcalculator.com, and you can poke around this site and it gives you a whole bunch of good information on how the CPI is compiled and how it is put together. So that is where I got a lot of this information. So that is how inflation is calculated. Now, 8.3% is pretty high. You know, everybody is complaining, of course, because we've enjoyed very low inflation historically for quite a long time. The economy has done really, really well. In fact, we've gone into an inflationary cycle that was so low that the Federal Reserve lowered their what they call prime lending rate down to between 0 and 0.1%. So it was so low that the Federal Reserve really didn't have any way to stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates anymore. So all they could really do is increase the amount of the monetary supply. Well, along comes COVID, of course, and the COVID, of course, risked everybody's livelihood as they closed all the businesses and people lost income because they couldn't go to work. Businesses lost income because they couldn't have customers. And the whole economy ground to a halt. Well, that is a deflationary cycle, of course, because at that point, with no money trading hands, you've got the value of goods going down. You've got food being wasted because it couldn't be purchased off of store shelves. You had to stay sequestered. You know, a lot of challenges at that point in time. So let's look at what the inflation rate has been over time. Over time, we've got this chart here. And this chart shows that, you know, from about 2000 on, we've had relatively low inflation rate at right around the 2% mark. Now, what's interesting about that is this inflation rate that they show here is going to be the core inflation rate. Currently, last month, that was at 6.6%. So if any of you are feeling the pinch of trying to put gas in the car or put food on the table because maybe you have a large family or you're a young family, you've got a situation where literally the core inflation rate is only 6.6, but the headline inflation rate is 8.3. The difference is the fact that energy, gas in the car, or fuel oil in your furnaces, or propane, if you use propane to heat your house, that energy component, along with the food component, is hitting you pretty hard. You might feel that the inflation rate is really understated if you have to deal with a lot of commuting or a large family with a lot of mouths to feed. But if you look back here at the 1980 time frame, now my wife and I got married in 1980. We got married in the midst of this inflation spike right here, that it was the core inflation was 13.14%. So we have we're about half of that right now. It's very painful. I'm not going to make light of that. But this was incredibly painful. It led to mortgage rates at 18%. There was no way to afford a house. Not at all. There was a whole slew of people who would carry back loans on their houses just to get them sold. In other words, they would take the down payment and they would take the loan out on their own and give a decent interest rate to the buyer just so they could get their house sold, because a mortgage was pretty much unaffordable at that time. Well, you can see it started dramatically going through the mid 80s to the late 80s. It came down, and then we hovered around 4% until finally the 90s came and it slowly got under control. But those kind of inflation rates are incredibly painful. This is what was called at the time called the stagflation. Unemployment was high at the same time, and right now we're not seeing unemployment really high. So here's kind of an idea of how they compute inflation. And so if you enjoyed this, please hit the subscribe button, help me grow this channel, and we'll look forward to seeing you again later. Thanks.